afternoon. Welcome back to the Me on Build Back Better e-conference. I see I think we've actually grown participants over the lunch break. I hope you've not just left your computers on and gone for a sandwich. Also welcome to those that are watching through Facebook as well, because I understand one or two have had problems with Zoom this morning, so hopefully you managed to catch up with the events on Facebook. And just a reminder, we will be releasing the sort of snippets from this morning's discussions and trying to keep the discussion going beyond the event, but that'll be something to come on the next few days. So I think we've had a fairly rigorous morning in terms of the discussion and the presentations, very high quality discussion and very high quality presentations. Some interesting takeaways from this morning's session, a discussion about the best way forward regarding a range of things, back to the old discussions of CapEx and revenue or TOTEX, which is a very difficult issue to resolve. I think the industry split on that one. Commentary on the fact that government structures may be holding back the delivery of the very projects that government wants delivered, and perhaps a need to resource the DFT more internally to actually facilitate rapid transformation to support industry. I need to focus on full life costings and maintenance resilience. And we'll hear more of that this afternoon, I think, in Rufus's presentation. The need for SMEs to play a bigger role in maintenance frameworks, potential development further of ADEPT LCRIG collaboration. I think that'd be a really wonderful outcome from the event to see that grow. And also the capacity for SMEs to support more employment and the broadening of the workforce. And we've had a question over lunchtime regarding that, and we'll refer back to that in the last round table. But certainly how can we move to supporting SMEs actually engaging more, and how can that be resourced, engaging in recruitment and the likes of that. So a very busy morning and an equally busy afternoon, where we've got presentations from Mark Stevens on collaboration, and we've got Dr. Rufus Howard from IEMA talking about sustainability and resilience. Those sessions will be followed by a Q&A for the collaboration session, and an additional engagement session with some senior consultants within the highway sector engaging with Rufus and talking about some of the issues around sustainability and resilience. So a hyperactive afternoon, I think. And again, if you've got questions, comments, observations, please put them in on the questions and answers, and we'll get those questions aired, and we'll get some answers, and we'll get some further debate and discussion on it. So I think we're more or less ready to go. I'm just looking at my screen here to see if I've got Mark, and if Mark wants to switch on his camera, he's there. Hi, Mark. Ready to go. So here we are.
Okay, thanks, George. So if I could say a few words first before we launch into this. Earlier on this morning, we were talking about the highway maintenance efficiency programme and some of the issues that floated around with how that programme seemed to just fizzle out. Well, originally it was a programme devised by the DFT to achieve a significant amount of savings. It's supposed to be by the sector for the sector. However, part of the issue was that DFT had a certain amount of money that they were funding it by and wanted to make sure that the sector took it over. So there was something called the HMEP Strategic Steering Group that was formed. I was a participant of that in terms of an advisor capacity, as was Jeff Allister from the Highway Turn Maintenance Association. And it was a DFT-led group, really looking at 4 different organisations that were trying to pull together and continue the work of HMEP. And that was the Local Government Association in terms of peer reviews, local partnerships in terms of document management, in terms of a lot of the documentation had been generated through HMEP. The communications side was supposed to be dealt with by the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, and Measure to Improve were looking to share the message in a different way through Connect and Share. A number of meetings took place over a couple of years, actually, but the main stumbling block here was the funding issue, where in order to actually maintain the documentation that we generated to date, it needed some funding, and there didn't seem to be any mechanism by which to do that. So as a piece of collaboration, it didn't work. So my presentation that you'll shortly be seeing is about how perhaps you can make collaboration work and some examples of how that happens. So at this point, I'll ask our assistant to push play. Take it away, Gary. Thank you. Hi there, I'm Mark Stevens, the Assistant Director of Operational Highways at Suffolk County Council and the Chair of the Engineering Board of ADEPT, which is the Association of Directors of Environment, Economy, Planning and Transport. Today, I'll be speaking to you about collaboration and how that can be how that can be used to build resilience and sustainability. I'm going to start by giving you some reassurance as to why I feel I'm well placed to talk to you on this subject. And then introduce you to some of the thinking behind the theory of collaboration. Next, I'll give you some indication of what that can look like in practice, whilst also demonstrating that if your collaboration is good enough, it can get you past challenges such as COVID-19. I'll talk a bit about the Highway Sector Council and its work in putting together a highway sector deal, but also clarify that opportunities already exist to do things differently. I will then wind up the presentation with a few closing thoughts. So between 2007 and 2015, I was at Leicestershire County Council, where my first priority was to set up the Midlands Highway Alliance, an alliance between 10 local highway authorities and the Highways Agency. That type of collaboration between local highways authorities now exists in many parts of England, and in fact I chair the Eastern Highways Alliance. I originally became involved in the Highway Term Maintenance Association through the membership of the DLO group, a group of local authorities with their own direct labour organisations, but was repeatedly asked to stay involved long after the DLO group's membership of the MHA had expired. For the last few years, I was the only local authority or client rep on any of its working groups. And that was of two-way benefit because I could then make sure that the private sector was heavily involved in the Highway Maintenance Efficiency Programme in my role on its Quality Assurance Group, which vetted all of the ADEPT documentation. I put collaboration into practice at Suffolk. ISO 44001, Collaborative Business Relationship Management, was achieved in 2017, and we've actually retained that ever since. I think we're either the first or the second local highway authority to actually gain that accreditation. Now, the Department for Transport considers Suffolk Highways as an exemplar highway service, and so did the judges for the Highways Awards back in 2018. Dave Wright, the former chief executive at Kia, believed that the benefits of collaboration should be shared, so he set up the Collaborative Learning Circle, comprising private sector, public sector and the British Standards Institution, with the mission of sharing the knowledge that we had collectively gleaned. And once COVID-19 started affecting just about everything going, I was then asked to help with the task of rebuilding the highway sector. So a pretty strong background in collaboration, so hopefully you'll stay with me for this. So moving on to some of the theory. Now, this rather peculiar looking version of the circle of life in creating a partnership arrangement is as seen by the academics at Oxford. It's a case of defining what you want, taking into account all the factors that may affect the partnership, putting a formal words together to bring the partners involved into one, and then making sure that that partnership has legs. The task of looking at a partnership from all sides means that everyone should be content with the final outcome. Assurance is mutual and value for money is secured for everyone, otherwise it won't last. As you work your way around the diagram, you'll see that that is almost like a procurement cycle, but it's actually applied to developing an actual partnership. So when I arrived at Suffolk in 2015, the relationship between Kia and the council was literally going down the pan. I was tasked by the leader of the council, my cabinet member of highways, to fix the relationship, even though scrutiny committee said tear up the contract and Kia wanted to know the end to the financial pain that they were suffering. So this table actually reflects what I felt was necessary if the relationship was to not only survive, but to flourish. I refer to much of the documentation that's floating around about BS 11,000, the Collaborative Business Relationships, the forerunner of ISO 44001, and the steer that one could get from the Institute of Collaborative Working and the various documents that they had. The relationship between the council and Kier at the time when I got there was very one-sided. The council pushed out most of the risk to Kier, and yet it aspired to create a one-team setup. Well, from my perspective, a single team meant sharing the pain as well as the gain. It also meant taking a longer-term approach by considering what needed to change in order for the contract to be of mutual benefit and potentially last a 10-year full term. At that stage, it was only destined for 5. Together, these were the documents that we worked at as a team between Suffolk and Kier to achieve the mutual assurance that we now have in each other's commitment to perform well. But in terms of changing the way in which the two parties were working, a clearer set of objectives were needed. And that's where the Alliancing Code of Practice came in. This set out a whole list of things to do that were more associated with the feel of the relationship rather than just the paperwork. So we collectively went back to the start in terms of on that 4x4 frame you see in front of you, the deciding box at the top. We had to consider what we wanted from the Alliance and then build the foundations of what it was supposed to look like. Only then could we deliver this one team notion and think about how we could actually sustain it once it was created. Now, if you look at the 4 elements on the side, excuse me, that relates to behaviour, how we should all be acting and what culture should be in place. Integration, if there are separate offices for the council and they're geographically remote from Kier personnel, how can we be one team? Leadership from the top, I and the other senior managers all had to be seen to be pulling in the same direction, not ripping each other apart. What we did filtered down through all the managerial levels so that we all led by example. And then lastly, commercial. The council wanted savings, Kier wanted a profit. So we needed to rethink what that might look like and how. By pooling our resources, we could both achieve financial benefits rather than one party achieving benefit to the detriment of others. So in overall terms, the Alliancing Code of Practice really tries to summarise all of this into a number of bullet points. A team is essentially formed to achieve a specific purpose but works together. Trust is the key. A really important element for Suffolk Highways was to establish joint values, behaviours and objectives. If you don't know where you're going, how can you get there? But you can lead as a team, not just as an individual. So some really important points in here about how to collaborate and the thinking behind it. But what about the reality of the situation in terms of actually really doing an acid test of how relationships are? I'm also part of something called the Future Highways Research Group, which was established back in 2014, essentially by Kier at that stage, putting together a number of clients, but also some thought leaders. Now, the Future Highways Research Group decided back in 2019 to do some research into how good a fit there was between what clients were looking for, what contractors and the service providers were delivering, and what equally those service providers were looking for. So Proving Services, who run the Future Highways Research Group, pulled together this assessment card, fired out to everybody concerned. Some really interesting results coming back. And it looks, I've got a number of different slides on this, but I've picked out 2, given the value added factors and the reference I made earlier onto value for money. In this looks at the difference between where a client would start off at the beginning of the contract in terms of expectations of what was going to really add value. And during the course of the contracts that each of those different clients actually experienced, there was a shift. Now, on the left-hand side of this, it actually picks up on some of the areas that the Future Highways Research Group is focused in on. But you can actually see there's only a 37% consistency between where the clients thought they were going to go to in terms of adding value and where they were ending up at that point in time when the survey was undertaken. So already a 2/3 shift. Looking at from the provider side, in terms of what they'd promised to deliver at the start of the contract and what they're actually able to deliver at the point in which the survey was taking place, a big gap in terms of the orange line denoting what was being promised and what was being delivered, as opposed to the expectations in terms of the blue line. 11% consistency. So clearly within the contracts that were being analysed, there was a growing gulf between what was actually being predicted, forethought at the beginning of the contract and what was actually happening in reality. So in overall terms, this suggests that there's perhaps not quite such a good collaboration in place in many of the contracts across the country. And that's perhaps where the focus needs to shift. Now, I talked earlier on about COVID-19, and I'm picking up here on some of the performance of Suffolk Highways in terms of how we responded back in March 23rd when we went into lockdown, and prior to that, thinking about what do we need to do differently. As a team, and when I talk about a team, I'm talking about the senior leadership team of Suffolk Highways, a fairly equal balance between Kia and Suffolk County Council personnel. We looked at this together and identified there were certain things that we could do, such as shifting from 2-person highway inspections to 1 person, looking at longer defect response times for some of the longer repairs that we'd ordinarily target. Extra vehicles were brought in, and we were prepared to pay for that as a client in terms of meeting the extra cost through PPN 220, but also support the supply chain in terms of what they were trying to do. We decided that we're going to keep cyclical works unchanged. We weren't going to change any of the scheduling on that, changing none of the commitments, and we even accelerated the surfacing and surface dressing works on the basis of the additional money that we knew was going to come through. So in the infographic you see in front of you, picking up on a few points here, during that first 3 months of April through to June, which is what this covers, what we saw was a 30% increase in productivity in relation to our gangs. Fantastic achievement. In terms of the number of gullies cleansed down at the bottom there, 11% increase on what we were achieving the year beforehand. But we're doing so much more. We actually hit our target of delivering 1,000 miles of road surfacing over a 4-year period. We hit that early because we gave that extra commitment. But we only achieved this through collaboration. That was the only way we delivered it. Moving now on to the Highway Sector Council. Some of you may or may not have heard about this, but essentially back in 2019, the suggestion was made to the highway sector that perhaps it would be an idea to create a highway sector deal. There are a number of such deals around. There's no promise of additional money coming into the sector, although we have actually seen an increase in funding for this year. But effectively, the idea was that we pulled together a highway sector. So the Highway Sector Council was being formed of private sector, public sector, major institutions such as the CIHT, Local Government Association, ADEPT, and really trying to map out what could be done, essentially more for no extra funding, but just by utilising the skills, the abilities of everyone else, working together. So a real cross-sector approach. But when COVID-19 hit, there's a real urgency that came to the sector in terms of trying to work out what could we do collectively. The government were absolutely desperate for things to remain as close as normal as we had before COVID-19 hit. And effectively, there were weekly meetings with the Department for Transport where they turned around and said, you know, where are things at the moment? So we've fed back. There's a real issue about key workers. You need to actually make sure that we can really give a real big attention to this. The DFT actually suggested that ADEPT should go away and produce some local highway safe operating procedures to actually bolster what was already there for the construction sector as a whole. So we're actually now at version 4 of this, but we'll also develop Project Safe Start, clarifying, as it says, how to best accelerate and bring forward local highway authority maintenance and deliver shovel-ready essential highway projects. Absolutely key. There are a number of different components to this, and those documents are actually shared by the DFT, totally endorsed by Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State, and Baroness Vere, the Roads Minister. But further encouragement to go away and really push for that highway sector deal proposal in what would actually be a new normal. Now that document has actually been formed and been submitted to the Department for Transport, who are reviewing at the moment. But it came about because of joint effort, collaboration, no holds barred, everyone thinking about what could be done differently, what can we move on, what can we actually really achieve if we've got the right circumstances. So in terms of looking at some of this, some of the thought was, okay, well, Brexit, What can we do differently? Some of the procurement rules around that will change. We can change it in the way that we want to, but also flagging up some of the legislation is really out of date. What can we do collectively to improve context? The Highways Act, the Road Traffic Regulation Act, you know, stuff that's around about 30 to 40 years old. What can we do differently? But equally, how can we respond to emerging legislation such as the Environment Bill, the issue about waste management, the issue about planning for the future, new development. And obviously in terms of recently there's been a big shift in terms of the travel modes that people have been choosing, a real push for active travel. How can we actually look at decarbonisation? What can we do in terms of natural resources, in terms of using solar, wind power? How does all this feed through into the highway sector? You know, how much of that can we actually shift across into wider thinking, into delivering a better service for the highway side of the country's activities, as well as pushing for greater consistency about government funding for looking after our highways assets. But we can also look at the margins of that and looking about how can we bring in new technology. Can we use sensors? Can we use big data? Can we use artificial intelligence to assess road condition? Can we introduce process automation to actually faster deliver some of the services we should be doing in them, at the moment? But equally looking at the waste chain in terms of going back to the Environment Bill, the introduction of the circular economy, thinking about more recycling. How can we actually get more life out of those pavements, for example? So there's lots of stuff that sits there at the moment that we can actually really push through in terms of delivering a far more improved service, but doing that together. So at the moment, there's opportunities to do things differently. I put a few examples up here on the screen. In Suffolk, we've introduced something called a community self-help scheme, whereby we allow the local communities to be trained and to go out on the network and do work of their own. It has to be in a controlled way in terms of making sure they've got suitable training or they've got suitable traffic management, which we might actually provide. But some of the people in Sudbury, they've actually got a group of very well-trained individuals who go around and they're doing minor maintenance work, stuff that we really can't afford, don't really focus in on, such as sign cleaning, edging back of footways. There's a whole area of activity, but we've actually created a scenario where we've worked with community to do work differently. And that's Suffolk Highways. It's not just the council, it's across both of them. We've been looking to try new technology. We've got a number of live labs that are running in the country at the moment, funded by the Department for Transport, operating through ADEPT. And that's where we're looking to use our street lighting infrastructure in a different way, putting sensors out there, measuring road surface temperature, gully levels, salt bin levels, picking up on traffic movement, using it as a mechanism to actually roll out 5G by having stuff actually fixed to the lighting columns. And equally in terms of some of the partnerships, so we're working a different way. I mentioned earlier on the Highway Sector Council, but LCRIG is an organisation that continues to grow. More and more members going out from a local authority perspective, but also from SMEs as well. It's an opportunity for them to tie into clients in a different way. And I've also indicated the RSC Foundation, where they've been working with ADEPT, looking at road condition, but now they're starting to link in with the likes of Measure to Improve, who run the National Highways and Transport Survey, and really trying to get under the skin of what is actually driving some of the statistics associated with public satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the highways sector. So there's always stuff that you can actually pull around at the moment. These opportunities already exist. It's just a case of capitalising on them. So closing slide, some closing thoughts in terms of what needs to be done to make sure that collaboration works as effectively as possible. So in terms of that lack of performance, in terms of the differential between the start of a contract and partway through, that's where a contract might not have the flexibility. So the clients have got to think about what is it you really want from that partnership. If you're going to try and get maximum value, you need to actually be able to move the goalposts to suit a changing world. Nobody could have predicted we would have had COVID-19 smack bang in the middle of a number of contracts at the moment. And it's interesting to see how some clients and some service providers have changed their tack during that period of time. And you can only do that really by understanding one another's issues. In terms of from a financial perspective, I think I mentioned earlier on, you know, Kia will be looking for a profit, we'll be looking for savings. Well, it's all about finance. It's a case of finding the common ground, putting the effort into actually making progress in those areas, and therefore really understand where you're going. But you've got to do that from the start. You've got to mutually agree where it is you're trying to take your relationship, where you're trying to take the service collectively. And if you are going to integrate, then think about going for ISO 44001, because it's a real test of how good you are and how closely you can work together. That Alliance and Code of Practice is well worth a read, looking at, and then you'll start to understand the depth of some of the things you really need to go into to really make sure you are collaborating effectively as possible. In terms of the value added slides, again, in terms of that analysis, well, there hasn't been a great deal of movement in terms of innovation, perhaps on the service provider side. Clients looking at new opportunities, you've got to be able to work together, explore what those opportunities are, take them forward. But all the way through, you've got to be able to foster and encourage change in terms of what you're doing, how capable you are, what capacity have you got. So it's an ever-changing picture in terms of what you want to do. But equally, make sure that you're keeping an eye on one another's performance. It's not just about clients managing service providers, it's also about service providers prompting clients to do things differently. And in that respect, if you're going to have really good collaboration, your partnership needs to be agile. It's not just a case of having one or two agile partners. Collaboration is working together. And if you can do all of this, you do build in that resilience and the sustainability. Okay, so thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. That was a really interesting presentation, and I think it starts to scope out the not just the potentials, but the realities in a number of local authorities, and the success in turnaround in terms of that relationship with Kiers, I think, holds a lot of lessons for perhaps a lot of contracts, and not just in the sort of global scope of that relationship, but actually even in the sort of elemental parts of it as well. There's a lot of points being raised in respect to the issues that you've talked through. I mean, I've got a number of questions here that have been generated by it as well. And of course, we've got some that have been carried forward from this morning. We talk about this morning about the DFT lacking the capacity to progress some policy issues and how long it takes sometimes for things to happen because they haven't got the resourcing. Do you think with that in mind, is there a way of actually fast tracking that legislative updates that you're talking about to facilitate new models for delivery and maintenance? Because there may be a willingness there, but if they've not got the either the legal expertise or the structures within the DFT, it seems to be possibly a pipe dream in making it change. Or does industry need to generate new models that then puts to government? What do you think?
I think the DFT is actually very receptive to a lot of the stuff that we come up with. Very much in the situation of wanting to engage more with the high risk sector. I've certainly seen a difference in their approach probably in the last 2 years in relation to how they've engaged far more with ADEPT. I get regular phone calls from the DFT, naming no names in terms of the people involved, but also beyond the DFT in terms of me being a point of contact for ADEPT, where they're asking questions, searching out what the answers might be. And I think there's a genuine desire to do things differently. I think parts of the problem we've actually had over the last 6 months has been the impact of COVID-19. I know that the guys at the DFT have been working on a shift basis. They've been moved around from one point to another. And there's an ever-changing political perspective as well, in terms of what you hear the ministers and the MPs saying. They're trying to respond to that in the right way, but sometimes things don't work. You know, and I think one of the things that you've got to accept in a relationship is that sometimes things are going to fail, but you've got to have an environment whereby you learn from your mistakes and move on. What the DFT do is they'll put things out, and if they make a mistake, it's really big news. So they can't afford to make mistakes. But what we've been trying to do, particularly from the ADEPT leadership team perspective, is engage more with DFT to say, look, if you want to take this thing forward, work more closely with us. We've been producing as an organisation a number of policy position statements. in terms of what we think needs to be done in a number of different areas. So recently I produced a policy position statement for e-scooters, suggesting there's a number of different issues there. There's a difference in terms of how you can use an e-bike compared to how you can, at the moment, use an e-scooter on a trial. So you need to get an even playing field on this. So there is a lack of capacity in the DFT. They're always stretched. You always know that in terms of trying to get hold of anybody within certain parts of the DFT. It's really hard. But equally, you know, there's a big organisation in terms of what they're trying to do. Policy isn't easy. It takes ages. If you try and think about a local authority perspective, how long did it take most authorities to pull together something like a highway infrastructure asset management plan? We were given, what, 2-3 years to achieve that, and even after that period of time, still not churned out. So we're expecting the DFT to come up with a policy and provide that lead, but a lot of the people within the DFT don't necessarily have the experience. So the ability to work more closely with the DFT is going to help in the longer term. I've actually said to Stephen Fiedler, the director at DFT, if you want to engage more, understand more about local authorities, you just need to ask. Do that and you'll actually get a lot further, a lot faster.
I think I would echo that. Certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, I think I've seen a lot greater interaction between the DFT and representative bodies. But it is that resource issue, and you'd wonder whether it's the resource issue or lack of resources that's led to the greater engagement, or the greater engagement actually just exposes the lack of resources, because since the financial crash, they've lost so many professionals and experts that it makes it very, very difficult. But it's really actually marrying up that resource shortage and actually providing a neutral stance when you're collaborating. So you're not just pursuing one set of goals, but the common goal. But it's certainly something that needs to be taken forward, I think. You also, the question come in here about talking about the research that was undertaken by the FHRG, Future Highways Research Group, into the gulf between the sort of prediction and reality for local authorities and contractors. What do you think are the primary reasons for this? Is it down to contractors gaming tenders to win them? Is it a lack of reality in contract expectations from either side? Or is it a poor understanding of either party's needs? What do you think is the prime driver in that gulf?
I think there's a number of different reasons it happens. A lot of the time, the procurement process is a very competitive one. So everyone gets over the quality hurdle. It's then boiling down to price. So everything's keenly priced. And if you've got, if a service provider is working for a client who isn't particularly open to suggestions about working in different ways, then if you're expecting the contractor to do something different but not pay them for the cost, why would they want to do that? So from a service provider's perspective, you can actually take the stance, well, we put in our tenders to deliver the service, we're delivering the service you first asked us about. If you want to deliver more, then you need to pay us differently for these aspects. But equally, from a local authority and a client perspective, you can't see around the corner. You can't see what's going to happen in 2-3 years' time unless you've got a fantastic crystal ball. Which local authority could have predicted COVID-19? That's Dean Koontz or one of his relations. You could not have predicted it. So in terms of changing circumstance, I think that's where it's been helpful with the DFT turning around and say, well, here's PPN 0220, there's a mechanism to actually repay. In Suffolk, we've recognised additional cost that has come through for care for working differently to maintain the business as usual service. But there'll be many others that haven't responded that way. I'm aware of lots of authorities around the country that have actually said, well, our priority is delivering the waste collection service. It's not about maintaining the highways. So those local contractors would have suffered from that perspective. So there's different drivers depending on what you're looking at. Is there a reluctance to be innovative? I don't know. I know some contractors look to what is coming over the hill, want to actually take it on board. Others will sit back and say, no, we didn't actually price for that. You're not interested in paying for it. We're not going to do it. So the gulf grows anyway because everyone's perspective changes. The world changes. Nothing stays still. But the issue is, if you've started off on the wrong tack, it's then difficult to get back on the right tack. So maybe there's an issue in the sense of the original point I flagged up was about procurement. The process we have at the moment in place to actually secure a partner for a local highway authority, I think, is wrong. It's geared heavily towards pricing. Cost is obviously important, but what is it you're really looking for? Are you looking for a very cheap service, or are you looking for a quality service? If you want quality, you have to pay for it. So for me, there's a difference in terms of what we need to start thinking about. And I think that, you know, at the moment we're in a situation where Brexit does provide an opportunity, as I said in my presentation. You know, we don't have to follow the OJU practice at the end of this year. We can actually go down a different route. So is there something to be done differently with public contract regulations? Is there something we can actually do differently in terms of how you go about having longer framework contracts, for example? They're tied for 4 years. Well, why are they tied for 4 years? Can we not go for something longer? There's an opportunity at the moment to change things. The Highway Sector Council has put in its notions for what a highway sector deal might look like. It's sitting with the ADEPT at the moment and they're reviewing that. But there's all sorts of stuff, as I said in my presentation. A lot of legislation's out of date. And again, you know, local authorities, senior officers such as myself, offering to help the DfT to start to rewrite some of that legislation to get it into the current world. But technology is moving at a different pace. Yeah, what's going to be happening next year? How many lenses are you going to get on a camera next time? Is it going to be 4? Is it going to be 5? So that whole about artificial intelligence, the ability to use that to actually detect potholes through machine learning, through artificial intelligence. There's a whole new bag out there, but what that's doing is moving away from what a contractor would have priced for at the moment. So unless you've got a really flexible contract, flexible relationship, and you're in some formal partnership where each is taking a risk, each is benefiting from the gain, you're never really going to move forward in the right way. And there's some of the issues I think float around in this area.
I think there's some very salient points there around flexibility, and it's a flexibility on all sides. When I was just looking at the figures that were quoted this morning, is that between 10 and 15 highway authorities that will be out to retender in the next 2 to 3 years.
More than that.
We're running out of time to develop a flexible model that could even start to consider some of those variables that you've highlighted. And that, I suppose, is quite a worrying thing, because it means we're not going to be building back better, we're just going to be building back much the same as we've had in the past. There's a very real risk attached to that. And I think that probably starts to emphasise the importance of a team that exists, sort of pan-contract across the local authority, and the team is actually about delivery. It's not about which side of the fence you sit on. The important part of it's actually seeking to do the same thing. Can we maybe just come back to the Sector Leadership Council, which we talked about earlier, and I touched on the point that had been raised about the representation. And this isn't by any way designed to be a criticism, it's really just an observation that it appears to be all large businesses that are involved with the Sector Leadership Council, and understandably, because they are the organisations that have the resources and possibly have got the capacity to look beyond the horizon as well. There's the largest number of SMEs maybe struggle with that. They don't have they're more tactical approach than a strategic approach. Not all of them, but a large number of them. How do we square that circle? The Sector Leadership Council, at some point, will have to represent an interest that maybe not in the best interests of the constituent parts, because they'll have to work to develop a model that doesn't benefit big business, but benefits the outcomes. You're sitting much more on the inside of this than the rest of us. How do you perceive that, and do you see that? Is there a conflict, a potential conflict in there?
I think that you're talking about the Highway Sector Council rather than thinking about leadership in there. The Highway Sector Council, it was something that started off, as I said, back in 2019. I think you actually went along to the first meeting. I was at the inaugural meeting, yes. Yeah, so happy memories. And it's evolved, it's moved on. I think part of the issue is that as a sector, we're not very well joined up. We are broken down into so many different components. There's so many different institutions. We've got the Institute of Highway Engineers, we've got the CIHT, you've got the Institute of Asphalt Technology. There's all these different organisations sitting there, all with a vested interest in terms of how we're delivering the service. And part of the issue equally is, you know, I mentioned earlier on about Elcrig and the fact that I contacted Martin Duff to say, look, how can we actually join these organisations together? Part of the problem with the Highway Sector Council is that it has got that, that sort of tier 1 representation, not a lot going on further down. And I think in some ways it reflects the situation that used to exist in the Highway Return Maintenance Association in terms of lots of tier 1 contractors, not many SMEs. So it's really difficult to get the right balance, and you can't have a cast of thousands if you're going to try to actually make any decisions. So you can't have 50 members of that particular council all coming up with the same perspective, because they won't. So it depends upon organisations such as ADEPT, CIHT, LGA to be in there, putting across a different view, being mindful of everything else they hear outside of that room, if you like, to make sure that everyone is actually on the game. At the moment, the Highway Sector Council doesn't actually have that breadth of representation I think that's needed. It is very much service provider led rather than being a local authority initiative or led, but certainly the right representation is going to be absolutely key if that is going to be given any credibility. It's been looked at by the DFT as a means of trying to deal with COVID-19 in the initial stages. The extent to which it looks to the Highway Sector Council in the longer term, who knows? I
think the lesson from that, and the lesson from that historically, is about the need to, and I'll use a phrase that's used in FHRG terms, is actually mutuality. It's what is for the greater good and what are the common goods that sits within particular approaches, whether they're strategic approaches or tactical approaches. But it's not easy, and having sat on the inside of it, having been the Chief Executive of HTMA, trying to balance the needs of tier 1s and the emerging needs and requirements of a growing small business membership. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it comes very close to it at times. And I think that it's a nut that needs to be cracked for the benefit of the sector and its clients, and for the people that we all serve, the customers, the ultimate customers, the road users.
Absolutely, and the other point I would actually make is in terms of local highway authorities. There's 155, is it, around the country? Who does actually do the work the same way out of those? And who's right? Which one is right? Which one's wrong? So within a local authority, you have opposing views. Sean and I were debating the issue about TOTEX earlier on. Do you actually bring capital and revenue together? Well, he thinks they should. I think we shouldn't. So you're never going to get everyone sort of singing to the same song sheet. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. Every opinion is valid. It's sort of a question of how many people think along the same lines as you do.
Well, and of course the fact that innovation requires people to take different perspectives, because that's actually what delivers innovative solutions. And it would be a very dull world if we all agreed with each other all the time.
Absolutely.
You talked about agile partnerships, and there's a question here actually about how do you build trust? There's so many contractual relationships that appear to lack that trust, each side blaming the other. So how do you foster change and how do you foster trust? And I think the Suffolk example is a really good example of actually going from I think you called it a car, not in your presentation, but in previous discussions, it was almost a car crash situation, to one that actually is operating for mutual benefit, and quite transformative in that respect. So it'd be interesting just to draw out a bit more of your experience of fostering change that allows you to foster trust, and hopefully there's some lessons there for others.
Yeah, I mean, it was a car crash, quite simple, when I got there. It's just a fascinating environment to step into. When I first started there in September 2015, I thought, you can't rebuild this. It was so far gone that scrutiny committee wanted to chat the contract. Keir wanted to walk away. It was 2 years in. So my task was to make sure it got back on an even keel. So that's why I started looking at other alternatives in terms of what ISO 44001 documentation, what the Institute of Collaborative Working was suggesting, what the Alliance Code of Practice was suggesting. Think, how can you actually bring this together? I felt like a marriage counsellor at times, not that I intend going in that direction, but it was very much a case of looking at what does each partner want from this. It's really important to understand the different perspectives, and ultimately, what are we looking to achieve from this? The contract said about creating one team. That's what Kier thought they were going to do, and they weren't being dealt with as an equal partner in that team. So it's really a case of just looking at balancing risk, balancing pain, balancing gain, and making sure that we collectively knew what direction we're going in. And I said, do you want this to continue to be a car crash, or do you want this to be something that everyone looks at and envies? So the aspiration quite early on in terms of a long-term objective was for that relationship to be a flagship. And it's actually one of the partnership objectives written into in early 2016, I think 17 rather, that it would be a flagship arrangement. So with that direction of travel, we knew what we had to do. Equally, the people who'd been involved in it were really tired of banging their head against the brick wall because they were looking severely bruised and they just wanted something different. So effectively, I was just like someone coming in to lead them out of that mess. I'm not going to use any biblical equivalent, but effectively they needed to be given a direction of travel and really brought together into one. Think this is the direction of travel. You may or may not agree with it, but this is the way we have to go. Otherwise, you're not going to get to where you want to be, which is in a much better position. And the trust came in time because it was built up over a period of time. I had 6 work streams in terms of our transformation program. I had 3 leads from Kier, 3 from County Council. We did things evenly and equally. And each time we made a decision, we took it jointly. We created a senior leadership team rather than a senior management team because we wanted to be a collective leadership. We tackled the thing together. And if you're not prepared to do that in that way, then you're going to go nowhere. So the trust came in time, but everyone was actually confident that we could actually get to a better place than we're in at that point in time. So a lot of the issue there is when you're in a contract that's going badly, you can dig yourself out of that hole. The challenge, I think, is how do you get to a point where you don't have to go through 2 years of pain and thinking there must be a better way? How do you start off a contract in the better way? And I think that goes back to the procurement process. Effectively, you've got to find a different way of finding an organisation that marries up with your own if you're going to go down that route. I think there's a different process that's followed out in Australia in terms of how they tie with utility companies. It's like a bit of a beauty parade. They find out beforehand, is this organisation going to work well with us or isn't it? And if there's a complete mismatch in terms of the direction of travel, it ain't going to happen. And one of the big flaws I felt at Suffolk was that they hadn't thought what they were looking to achieve in the longer term. They hadn't resolved what their joint objectives were going to be. And without those, they didn't then think about how do we want everyone within the partnership to behave, and what do we value? What are we going to work to on a day-to-day basis in terms of how we perform as a team? So that's why I think it was important to have those values, behaviours, and objectives absolutely ironed out. They're the sorts of things you've got to have in place before you start down that route. That takes you back to that Alliance in Code of Practice, that first line on that table, that 4x4 grid, behaviour. Know what your behaviour has to be, you'll get to the right place. If you're going to have bad behaviour, you're going to be a naughty boy and be sent to the headmaster's office because it's not going to work.
It's remarkable what you've been able to do there, Mark, insofar as engaging volunteer help and you know what you refer to cycling and all the way up to a county council, and then we're talking here about representation at highway sector council level. And I fully agree with what you're saying about trust. Trust is obviously the underpinning value for mutuality for that to be able to work properly. I wonder whether, do you think that would also go towards changing the profile of the sector in the public's view? And it's not, and I think they touched on in Elcrig's presentation earlier, there's the headline things like abuse of road workers and the like, so that if we can engage the public in some contribution, and it goes back to what we're saying about social value, and if we could convey that value back up to DFT level, is that a path to follow, do you think?
I think part of the problem is the expectation of the public completely outstrips what we can actually deliver. The expectations are completely misguided. Most of the, I remember looking at the NHT survey data a few years ago, and one of the things I said when we started off on the communications work stream at Suffolk was we've got to find a way to get it the over 65s opinion of what the local highway network looks like to change. they've got to engage in a different way. We've got to engage with them in a different way. Everyone understands the fact there's a lack of money, but that doesn't mean to say they're not going to start pushing you to repair that pothole outside their house. And as I mentioned earlier on, we're having this conversation about the importance of road surface. The road surface is more than just there for car usage. It's for the cyclists. The footways are there for people to walk on. But there's not the money to look after it. You know, I evaluated that for Suffolk, we could afford to resurface our roads every 240 years. We could afford to repave or resurface our footways every 449 years. You haven't got a cat and hell's chance of keeping everybody happy. And if that's that's what you're up against, you've got no chance whatsoever of keeping the public on board. That's why levels of satisfaction are as low as they are. And that's why, from an ADEPT perspective, we were quite happy to engage with the RAC Foundation to look more at some of the condition data. Now, the DFT only see the results in terms of road condition indices for red condition. They don't see it for amber, they don't see it for green. But the piece of work I did and presented to them back in July of last year indicated that over the next 10 years, if they don't double the amount of money going into the highway sector, about 40% of the network will be in red, not just bits and pieces, because it's the stuff that's coming over the hill, the bit in the amber. They're starting to be peaks in amber. And this is what the RSC Foundation work has really picked up. That's gone back into DFT to say, okay, what do you want to do with this? And they've not come up with an answer because they recognise there's a real problem. But what it does, it gives them the ammunition to go to Treasury and say, this is what's coming over the hill. Politicians are having their ears bent at Member of Parliament level as well as locally about the state of the roads. That is going to continue unless you put more funding into it. And it's for that reason, I think, that we had a £500 million increase for this year and potentially over the next 4 years. But at the moment, they don't know whether or not we're going to keep the baseline of $1 billion per year in going to the highway sector going forward or not. You know, we're all second guessing at the moment. But that's sort of part of the challenge, you know, as we move forward.
I think that's a really good point to end on, because that actually starts to call into question the overall sustainability of the network as it's currently used. And I say that advisedly, following on from our roundtable earlier on about the fact that is this a highway for cars or is it a transportation network? And therefore we get a hierarchy of importance, which might provide us with an opportunity to recast what we do in a different light and recast some of the financing and funding of it. Mark, thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for your very forthright responses to the questions as well.
Very, very intelligible, Mark. Thank you very much indeed for that.
I know that I know there's a number of people that would shy away from answering some questions. I'm interested that you don't shy away from. I'm interested in maybe developing at some point forward this cultural prenuptial agreement between highway authorities and contractors, because that actually maybe is a really, maybe a positive, I say it in a joking sense, but possibly something that could be developed further to ensure that people are actually on the same track from the outset. We can raise some of these issues again on the round table after the next session. But thank you for now, Mark, and for the rest of our speakers who I can see are all sitting online as well. I look forward to welcoming you back into the round table and your perspectives and views on some of the things we've spoken about.